I stood in front of a supermarket shelf longer than I expected. A small item rested in my hand, and even though I could afford it, I felt an odd need to justify buying it. I eventually put it back on the shelf. It wasn't because the price was too high or because we were short on money. The reason felt harder to name. On the way home, that feeling stayed with me. I kept wondering why such a small decision felt so heavy, and why I always felt the need to explain myself. Little by little, something started to feel strange. Our finances were more organized than before, yet I still didn't feel completely free. My name is Clara, and a simple question had started changing the way I looked at money and marriage. Did everything always have to belong to both of us? The morning began the way it usually did. I prepared breakfast while Arman read the news on his phone, and Mira searched the house for a missing sock. When the house grew quiet again, I opened our family finance notes. Our emergency fund was slowly growing, and our debt was slowly shrinking. Those numbers usually made me feel relieved. But that day, another feeling appeared, and I could not quite explain it. Later that afternoon, I noticed a book I had wanted for a long time. It was not expensive and still fit comfortably within the budget. Even so, I paused. My mind immediately wondered whether I should tell Arman, and whether I needed to explain why I wanted it. I knew Arman had never stopped me from buying things. He had never tried to control how I used my money. Yet every small decision still felt like it needed an extra conversation. And I was beginning to feel tired of carrying that feeling. At first, I treated it like a small thing. I thought maybe I was simply overthinking it. Then I started noticing a pattern. The same feelings seemed to return again and again. Whenever I wanted to buy something for myself, set aside a little money, or make a small decision, the feeling appeared. It showed up in moments that should have felt ordinary. I always felt the need to explain myself, to give reasons and prove that what I spent made sense. The more I thought about it, the stranger it felt. Because Arman had never actually asked me to do any of that. The pressure wasn't coming from Arman. It was coming from the system we had built without realizing it. For the first time, I found myself asking a different question. Had we ever really talked about personal needs within our family finances? That evening, I opened our family budget again after everyone had gone quiet. I looked through each category we had carefully created over time. Bills, emergency savings, debt payments, and goal-based savings were all there. Every section had its own place on the page. Everything seemed to be accounted for. On paper, it all looked neat and complete. Yet something felt absent when I looked at it. There seemed to be no space left for being an individual. I started noticing a contradiction I had never named before. We were growing closer as a team, yet sometimes I missed having a small space that felt like mine. That feeling made me uneasy whenever it surfaced. I worried it might sound selfish if I ever put it into words. Wasn't marriage supposed to be about sharing? If that was true, why did it still feel like there was a need we had never talked about? The days that followed felt ordinary. There were no arguments, no major problems, and nothing seemed out of place. Arman and I still shared the responsibilities of the house. We still laughed together over dinner the way we always had. Myra kept bringing home her funny stories from school. On the surface, everything still looked perfectly fine. Yet each time I opened the banking app, the same feeling quietly returned. It was a feeling I still could not name. Little by little, I realized the money itself was not what unsettled me. What lingered was the feeling of having no space that belonged only to me. The longer I kept that question to myself, the more present it became. It felt as though an important conversation was quietly waiting to happen. I wasn't ready to answer that question yet, but I could no longer pretend it wasn't there. That afternoon, Mira sat on the living room floor with colored pencils scattered around her. She was completely focused on her drawing, as if nothing else existed in the room. I sat beside her folding laundry, letting the routine fill the quiet afternoon. Every now and then my eyes drifted toward the picture taking shape on the page. Her drawing was becoming clearer. A small house stood beside a tree, with 3 flower pots carefully arranged nearby. I smiled as I looked at it more closely. Then I quietly asked why she had drawn 3 separate pots. Mira pointed at the picture, one piece at a time. She explained that the largest pot belonged to the family. Then she pointed to the 2 smaller pots beside it. One was for Dad, and the other was for Mom. I laughed softly at first, but when Mira said that roots would compete for space if every plant stayed in the same pot, I suddenly fell silent. That night, I kept thinking about Mira's drawing. The 3 small flower pots stayed in my mind long after the house had gone quiet. I began to understand something I hadn't noticed before. For a long time, I thought there were only 2 choices: everything shared or everything separate. But maybe life was not as simple as those 2 options. The thought lingered quietly in my mind. Maybe a healthy family did not mean every part of life had to blend together. Perhaps some spaces were meant to remain their own. It was not because we lacked trust. It was not because either of us wanted to hide something. Each person still needed a little freedom, a little sense of ownership, and a little space to remain themselves. For the first time, I did not feel guilty for thinking about it. I simply felt ready to bring it into a conversation. A few nights later, after Mira had fallen asleep, I asked Arman if we could talk. The house was quiet, and I felt the weight of a conversation I had been carrying for a long time. "I want to tell you something," I said quietly. Even as the words left my mouth, I felt nervous about saying them aloud. Arman looked at me without reacting. There was no defensiveness or suspicion in his expression, only quiet attention. I explained everything I had been feeling: the discomfort, the need for personal space, and the exhaustion of explaining small things all the time finally came into words. Part of me worried that he might misunderstand what I meant. I wasn't sure how my words would land once they reached him. Arman stayed quiet for a long moment. Then a small smile appeared, as if he had been thinking about something familiar. "I thought I was the only one who felt that way," he said. In that moment, I realized we had both been holding back the very same conversation. That night, our conversation lasted longer than usual. Neither of us seemed in a hurry to end it. We were not discussing numbers, investments, or debt. The topics that usually filled our financial conversations stayed untouched. Instead, we talked about feeling secure. We talked about freedom and trust. A few weeks later, we created a simple system. Nothing complicated, just something practical for everyday life. Our family savings stayed in place. Our emergency fund and shared goals remained exactly where they belonged. We also created small personal savings accounts for each of us. For the first time, personal needs no longer felt tied to guilt. The amount was not large. Even so, something felt different, and I moved through my days a little more lightly. The biggest change was not in our bank accounts, was in the conversations we finally allowed ourselves to have after avoiding them for years. I learned that trust does not always mean putting everything into the same place. Sometimes trust can also mean giving each other room. Room to grow, room to make choices, room to remain ourselves while sharing a life together. If our family's story feels familiar to you, I'm glad you spent this moment with us. I hope you'll join us again for the next chapter in our small family journal. And now I'm curious about your perspective. Do you think couples should only have shared savings, or a combination of shared and personal savings?